was painful to watch him sort of dancing around the question, changing the subject, and refusing to say that Putin is a bad guy. And in doing so, there's no strategy. I think the strategy is very simple. The Qataris gave him a $400 million jet. What's Putin going to give him?
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder on the show. He's spoken to us in the lead up to this, another round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine today in Istanbul. If we're going to get anything out of it, Bill and I get into that, and especially when it comes to Donald Trump's 2-week deadline that he gave Vladimir Putin to prove that he wants peace. So all that today, plus we speak about this military operation from Ukraine. It was absolutely brilliant in Zelensky's words. We also speak to him about the fact that Emmanuel Macron said it's time to test the United States' credibility if they're going to start implementing more sanctions, more tariffs to disrupt Russia's economy. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
We've got another round of peace talks today in Istanbul. We know that the UK, the US, Turkey, Russia delegates will all be in attendance. Zelensky says that they still haven't got the memorandum, which is, of course, this piece of diplomacy that Russia says that they've written down of how they maintain peace in the future. But of course, no one's seen it. No one knows if it's even real. Would it even matter regardless?
Well, everything that Russia has said, everything that Putin has said up until now indicates that his only type of peace is a capitulation of Ukraine. He's basically saying, if you want the war to end, surrender. And there has not been any other terms laid out. And those terms have been explicitly laid out every time there's a conversation about this. And so I think it's very unrealistic, overly optimistic to think that anything is going to come from these peace talks, because Putin has no willingness or, I would say, ability to back down. For him, being in this war is effectively his only insurance that he stays in his job. If the war were to end, the Russian people would then take stock of what had happened, and they would say, what a mess you created. This is terrible. And he would get arrested. He would have his money taken away, and he'd probably be killed. And so for Putin, there is no end game to this war. He has to carry on this war in his mind until he succeeds.
Of course, we know that Ukraine obviously wants peace and to live in a sovereign country without, without war and without Russian soldiers coming to take their land. But for right now, Zelensky's made it clear what he would want out of these talks. He says he wants a complete and unconditional ceasefire. He wants the release of all prisoners and the return of abducted Ukrainian children. Are you optimistic that he could even get those things?
Well, the one thing that there is some real business between Russia and Ukraine is in the exchange of prisoners. After that previous meeting in Istanbul, both sides agreed to release 1,000 prisoners of war. And so that has been happening. And we are also seeing some children, abducted children, being reunited with their families. And so that is happening. And so I don't think that we can rule that out. But when it comes to any type of withdrawal of military attacks, ceasefires, that's just not going to happen. And I think it's unrealistic for anyone to think that. And if anything, because Ukraine has been so successful in the last couple of days of hitting Russia where it counts, Putin has no interest in showing any weakness right now.
What do you think the strategy is here, Bill? Because we know that the Kremlin has again proposed these talks today in Istanbul. They obviously did it a few weeks ago, and of course they sent a embarrassing team of low-ranking officials within the Kremlin. But then again, we saw Donald Trump exercise this 2-week timeline, 2 weeks to prove that you actually want peace. So their response was, of course, another round of peace talks in Istanbul. But if they're playing out the way that you think they are, and basically there's no point even having these peace talks because they're not going to actually enter any sort of negotiation, what's the point of them even proposing to have a Russian delegate there or even have these talks in the first place?
Well, it's very straightforward. They need to give Trump something so that he can then carry on saying there is a process going on. Trump has been humiliated in this whole situation. He was the one who promised the war would end in 24 hours. He then said it's going to be 100 days, and it hasn't ended. It hasn't come anywhere close to ending. His involvement has done nothing, and so he has he's got some political capital on the line, and the easy way to prevent people sort of turning on Trump and saying, well, what these promises you're making are all empty. He can say, look, there's a peace process going on. Putin has told me so. Putin initiated another round of negotiations. And that way, Putin can save face with Trump. Trump can save face with the American people. And it doesn't look like the abject failure that it really is.
Do you see Trump's delegate Keith Kellogg and the other members going today? Do you see them being tough on Russia at all?
Well, it's no, I don't, because Trump has made it clear that America's going to do nothing. The Europeans and the UK have said that they're ready to really come down like a ton of bricks on Putin, particularly in the area of sanctions on oil. Should he not agree to a ceasefire. But America never agreed to that. And there are lots of people in America that would like tougher sanctions. Trump's big ally, Lindsey Graham, has proposed a piece of legislation which would impose 500% tariffs on anybody who purchased Russian oil. That's a pretty tough measure. That's a proposed piece of legislation. It's bipartisan. But at the moment, what we have is Trump unwilling to do anything mean to his friend Vladimir Putin.
Do you think that what Lindsey Graham has been proposing, do you think it's causing a bit of disruption and division within the party only, Bill? Because obviously we know that Lindsey Graham is a staunch supporter of Ukraine and a staunch supporter of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump clearly isn't listening to him or listening to any other member of the Republican Party if they're privately telling him that he needs to invoke these sanctions, these tariffs, this 500% tariff on Russian oil. That would be insane and make a huge dent. But of course, there is also concerns that that would disrupt the oil market. It would disrupt the price of gas and oil in the United States. And of course, I know that that was a big problem post-COVID and when the war originally broke out. But I wonder if Lindsey Graham behind closed doors is going to Trump and saying, look, we need to do this. This is the only way we can disrupt the Russian economy. And it's kind of falling on deaf ears because Donald Trump is clearly so concerned with upsetting Vladimir Putin.
Well, it's interesting because Lindsey Graham is absolutely in the right place on this as far as Ukraine is concerned. And there are other Republicans who feel as strongly as Lindsey Graham does. And so I would say that they've had some impact on the situation, not in terms of actions, but all these tough statements that Trump has made probably are to try to satisfy the Lindsey Grahams of the world. But he needs to go beyond making these tough statements and actually impose sanctions. And everything that we've seen so far suggests that Trump doesn't have that willingness. He has some really inexplicable kind of allegiance to Putin, which he doesn't want to break.
On that note, while speaking in Singapore, Bill, we saw French President Emmanuel Macron. He said that the decision to sanction Russia if they refuse a ceasefire today is a test of credibility to Americans. So he confirmed that he believes that Washington must show a commitment to Ukraine by sanctioning Russia, as you mentioned, by placing these tariffs on Moscow or any country that's importing Russian oil. So do you think that would be a common sentiment for the rest of NATO allies, that they think that the United States really needs to show a commitment, they really need to test their credibility by carrying out these procedures?
It's plain as day that Putin hasn't done what he's supposed to do. There was Ukraine agreed to an unconditional ceasefire a long time ago. Russia never agreed to any type of ceasefire. And it's been going on and on and on. And it's what I call the KGB rope-a-dope, where they just throw more discussions, negotiations, memorandums into the process and don't change their behavior. But for America not to react to this, it is, of course, a very grave test of U.S. foreign policy credibility. And of course, U.S. foreign policy credibility has taken a nosedive in relation to Russia since this whole thing started. America was voting with Russia, Iran, North Korea against resolutions condemning the invasion at the United Nations. There was a moment when the U.S. cut off military aid and cut off intelligence aid. And so American credibility in this whole story is deeply diminished. And Emmanuel Macron is correct that if nothing is done, at some point, the West, the rest of the world has to say, America's on the wrong side in this conflict.
We saw this 2-week deadline, as I mentioned, Bill. We saw Donald Trump last week. He came out and accused Vladimir Putin of being crazy. He says he's changed. He says that he has about a week and a half to 2 weeks to pretty much prove that he actually wants peace. But we've seen this ebb and flow between Donald Trump. We've seen these harsh words, and then we've seen him not condemning Putin enough. So if we get to this 2-week deadline, which would be next week, and nothing has happened, no changes made, Russia continues its offensive, and Donald Trump doesn't react in the way that he said he would, how do you think he'll be viewed for that?
Well, in the same way he is viewed for promising to end the war in one day and all the other empty promises that he made. I mean, he doesn't seem to be too concerned about his credibility. He doesn't seem to be too concerned about what he said yesterday, today. You remember he was, condemning Vladimir Zelensky, saying he started the war, and then when he was asked about that a week later, he said, "I didn't say that." And so it doesn't matter what he says. All that matters is what he does, what the U.S. government does. The U.S. government has enormous power to do something if they choose to do it. And all these words are now completely empty. There's no credibility in the words, only in the actions.
Ukraine, as you mentioned at the start of the interview, Bill, they had in Zelensky's words, a absolutely brilliant operation carried out on Sunday night last night. It took 18 months to plan. Zelensky said that drone strikes went deep into Russia and destroyed 1/3 of their strategic missile carriers, which are stationed at their air bases. This carrying out just one day before these peace talks set to begin today in Istanbul. Do you think, but where we will see Russia and Ukraine obviously sit down together, do you think that there was a direct message in that decision to carry these out last night?
Not at all. I think that the decision to carry out this raid on these air bases, this unbelievably historically successful military action, was something that had been planned for 18 months. They weren't going to alter the plans based on a bunch of nonsense, rope-a-dope peace negotiations that the Russians aren't sincerely engaging in. And so this operation was planned for a long time. It has very meaningful and life-changing consequences for the Ukrainians. These were jets that were launching air raids on Ukraine. In fact, some of the jets had been loaded with missiles that they were going to launch on Ukraine. And so this was something that had been planned out for a long time. This is something that's very real, and it's something that was very successful. It has nothing to do, the timing had nothing to do with what I would call the nonsense of what's going on in Istanbul right now.
There were reports that Trump was never told about this 18-month plan, Bill. Do you think that matters?
Well, I think it's very important because, and by the way, this wasn't just Trump. We also had under Biden all these demands that the Ukrainians couldn't do this, the Ukrainians can't fire that, they can't attack things inside of Russia, and so the only thing that Ukrainians were allowed to do under Biden was to hit Russian targets inside of Ukraine. And so, in a certain way, in an ironic way, the fact that Trump is sort of stepped back and said, "I'm not going to help Ukraine anymore," and so on and so forth, it gives the Ukrainians the freedom of movement and the latitude to do these types of attacks. And this was devastating. I mean, it's hard to understate the fact that they can't make these bombers anymore. They don't have the tools and the parts to make these bombers. And 1/3 of their strategic bombers have now been destroyed. That's unbelievable, truly.
And it just goes to show that clearly the Ukrainian military, even despite not having the green light from the Biden administration to be shooting long-range missiles and drones into Russia, they were still planning it all along and just waiting, buying their time for the moment they could do that. And it kind of just puts them on the same level as the Russian military, what they've been allowed to do. Of course, there's no restrictions there. But do you think that the Ukrainian military or Zelensky thought that Donald Trump might try and convince them not to carry out the operation, only in the sense that he might be telling him not to, provoke Putin any further?
Surely that if they had asked for permission, the permission would have been negative. They would have said, no, you can't do that. And so better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, which is what they've done. And by the way, this is, in Trump's world, Trump said that to Zelensky, you don't have any cards. Well, it looks like they have some cards. And, in a world where it's all about who's powerful and who's weak, the Ukrainians come out of here looking kind of powerful. If they can succeed in this type of operation, they'll make movies about this in years to come. It puts them in even though that they're a smaller country, even though their resources are limited, they've been able to take their ingenuity and their initiative and their ability to adapt, and even with unbelievably less resources, they've struck a major blow to a powerful enemy.
What are your thoughts on this quote? I thought this was really interesting, and it's completely in response to your takeaway from this attack overnight, Bill. But a Ukrainian government official, an unnamed one, was speaking to a BBC journalist based on Ukraine, and he said that the biggest problem right now is that the Americans have convinced themselves that we've already lost the war, and from that, the assumption everything else follows. So is your takeaway that this attack was the Ukrainian military saying to America, saying to Trump, look, we're still in the fight. We're rearing and ready?
Well, that's one of the many messages. The other message is to Vladimir Putin that, we will destroy your navy, which they've done. Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and they've been able to effectively destroy Russia's navy. Russia has had to hide their ships out of reach now, and it's no longer a factor. Now they've successfully destroyed a third of their major bombing force. The message is to Vladimir Putin that, the longer this carries on, the more we're going to degrade you to the point where you can't do anything. And by the way, this is not just good for Ukraine. Russia is a menace for the world. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, has been threatening nuclear war since this whole thing started. And all of a sudden, the Ukrainians have taken out a third of their strategic bombers, the bombers that would launch nuclear weapons. And so not only has Ukraine done a big service to themselves, they've done a big service to the rest of the free world by getting rid of a third of these strategic bombers.
And then we saw this, insane active propaganda, Bill, as we spoke off camera about, was in response to Ukraine attacking Russia's missile carriers. Russia then claimed that Putin's own helicopter came under fire from Ukrainian drones during his trip to the Kursk region. But then the Moscow Times came out and debunked this and said that this was just his authorities trying to convince Russian civilians that Putin is also at risk, that he's one of them, that even though Russian civilians are always at risk of attacks from Ukraine, so is Vladimir Putin. He's just like you guys. So what was your response to that?
Well, first of all, I'm very surprised that he even took a helicopter. I don't even know if we know that. Look, this guy is so scared of everything. He sits at tables that are like 30 feet long because he's afraid of getting COVID. This guy uses body doubles wherever he goes. We don't even know if he went to Kursk region or whether he sent somebody who looks like him. He's a paranoid little man. He's scared to death. I can't even imagine that he even took a helicopter, and so the whole thing doesn't ring true to me.
The Lithuanian Defense Minister, Bill, claimed that Russia is mocking the United States government by refusing to engage in proper ceasefire talks, and at the same time believes that the Russian army is moving fast with their armed forces reform, and we know that they plan on having 1.5 million active soldiers by the end of the year, which would make them the second largest active military force after China. So I feel like right now, is it crunch time to be able to kind of stymie their military operation?
Well, I don't actually think that there's that much difference between now and 6 months ago or even a year ago. I mean, neither side has a decisive military advantage. You mentioned 1.5 million soldiers. The Russians are losing between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers a day in battle. So how long does that 1.5 million soldiers last? You know, they'll truly be eaten up and spit out, you know, in a year or two or three. And so I think that, and by the way, they're not gaining any territory in the process. I mean, the amount of territory that the Russians are gaining compared to the loss of life and the loss of equipment and loss of money is an unbelievably bad trade. You know, they're not getting what they want. They're not getting anywhere close to their military objectives. You know, it would take them more than 100 years at this rate to take over Ukraine. And in the process, they probably would not have a population anymore.
Bill, if NATO allies, if the United States, if the EU, the UK continued to try and disrupt the Russian economy so much, would Putin even be able to pay these soldiers?
Well, that's the point, is at the moment he sells oil, and the dollars that he gets from selling oil, he uses to pay the soldiers, buy equipment, buy bombs and drones from the North Koreans and the Iranians, run his defense factories in Russia. And so anything that we can do to disrupt his financial ability means that the war will end quicker. But the war is not going to end in a negotiation where Putin thinks he has some upper hand. The war is going to end when he has no choice, and that's ending it as his best possible option. And the only way to get to that is by putting enormous military and financial pressure on him. And the only way to do that is by upping military aid and by dramatically increasing sanctions.
I want to read this quote out from Germany's Chief of Defense, Carsten Brunner. He said that Russia was a very serious threat and that it's coming to a point where we have to be prepared. He's talking about NATO. NATO has to be prepared as some of Russia's military stockpile is currently facing the West. He says we have to be ready by 2029. Up to then, we have to speed up in NATO. If you ask me now, is this a guarantee that's not earlier than 2029? I would say no, it's not. So we must be able to fight tonight. And for this fight tonight, we are ready. So do you think that that's a warning that Donald Trump would take seriously, in the sense that Russia doesn't plan on isolating this war just within Ukraine?
Well, I don't even want to try to get inside the head of Donald Trump. What I can say is that the Russians are at the moment kind of exhausted and depleted. But we can know I can get inside the head of Vladimir Putin because we've been watching him very carefully for the last 15 years, and he needs to be at war to stay in power. Ukraine is just one of many wars. He was in war with Georgia. He was carpet bombing Syria. He needs to be at war. He's made it his open, outright statement that he thinks NATO and European NATO members are enemies. He wants to get back the Baltics. He wants to go after Poland. And so for anyone to think that this is not a risk is naive. And of course, the German defense minister was correct in his assessment. The only thing I would say is that we do have time, because at the moment, Putin is exhausted. And it's going to take him some time under any circumstances to rebuild his capacities. And so it gives Europe, the UK, Europe, and other allies time to also arm themselves, so that if and when he's able to launch another attack, we're able to defend ourselves.
I want to get your thoughts just finally, Bill, on this reaction from Donald Trump. He was in this press conference with him and Elon Musk and Fox News' Peter Doocy. He was asking him about the fact that what's it like dealing with a stubborn president such as Vladimir Putin. And of course, Donald Trump then jumped in and said, oh, and Zelensky, saying that Zelensky is also very stubborn, kept saying very stubborn to deal with. How does that help the situation when you have Donald Trump saying, yes, Putin's stubborn, but then continuing to emphasize in a press conference how stubborn Zelensky is.
Well, it's a terrible false equivalence. Zelensky is the president of a country that was invaded by Putin. Of course, he's stubborn. He's stubbornly defending his country. He's a hero. Putin is stubbornly attacking a non-aggressive neighboring country who's defending themselves. To put them both into the same category and call them stubborn is really a huge disservice to bravery, honor, and heroism. I mean, Zelensky is a hero, Putin is a criminal, and that's how these people have to be defined. And for the president of the United States to put them on the same level is really a shame.
And the premise of the question, Bill, was Peter asking whether Donald Trump still believed that Putin was a bad guy, whether he was the good guy or the bad guy in this situation, to which Donald Trump didn't actually answer that question with a yes or no. He just kept saying that this war would never have happened if he was in power after the 2020 election. So I know that we can't get into Trump's brain so much, but is there a strategy behind this lack of condemnation from Donald Trump where he picks and chooses whether he's going to condemn Putin?
Well, it's pretty clear. It's obvious Putin is a bad guy. More than 90% of Americans think Putin's a bad guy. Everybody here in Europe thinks Putin is a bad guy. Putin is a bad guy. And for him to refuse to say that tells you everything. It's really a remarkable thing to watch him. I watched that interview, and it was painful to watch him sort of dancing around the question, changing the subject, and refusing to say that Putin is a bad guy. And in doing so, there's no strategy. I think the strategy is very simple. The Qataris gave him a $400 million jet. What's Putin going to give him?
Always a business deal. Sir Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.